The first was the foundation of the whole idea of linguistic communication on the notion of the experiential gap, the idea that there are gaps in the experiences between people. Each of us lives in a different experiential world. Doesn't mean that there are no similarities, but it means that we live in different experiential worlds, and what we have to do in order to be able to communicate beyond the experiential gap, across it, to bridge the experiential gap, is to be able to systematically mutually identify different people, mutually identifying points of similarities between the experiences and the pointing events that are like the quintessential events of naming are events in which what we're trying to do, what we're asking each other to do, is concentrate our attention experientially on certain things in the world and say, right now we're actually experiencing the same thing and we'll give it a name. And we talked about the construction of what I call the symbolic landscape, which is a digitized model of the world, which leaves most of the experiential stuff that is different between different people, leaves it outside and leaves us with a certain common ground, with a certain area of meaning, of semantics, the essence of which lies exactly in the fact that we have mutually identified it, that we have negotiated it, not necessarily in an egalitarian way. Of course, power gets into this very, very quickly, but we have negotiated something that lies, so to speak, between us. Then we said the second step was there's this symbolic landscape between us. What happens in linguistic communication? What happens in linguistic communication is what you get in the second page. Most of the last lecture was about that, and I put it on the board. The idea, generally speaking, if you look at the upper left side of this drawing, the speaker has an intent. The intent to communicate is experiential, it is private, it is prior to language. Of course, it may be influenced by language. We'll talk about that later. You asked me about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, so of course there are relationships. But basically, the intent is experiential. There's something that we want to communicate. And then language tells us there's a certain way you have to use the technology, you have to use language, a certain way you have to use the technology, stage by stage, in order to be able eventually to get the speaker, to get the listener to get something from you that will eventually allow the listener to get an experiential interpretation that hopefully will be as similar as possible to what you are trying to say. So from speaker's intent to speaker's message, which is already a message that is built from the building blocks of the symbolic landscape, and is thus already socialized and is thus already in terms that the others should hopefully understand. The message is then translated again in our mind into an utterance, which is a certain organization of the signifiers, which are then uttered. Then the listener has to listen to it, get a certain representation of the utterance, translate the utterance into a message, and then the message hopefully into an experiential interpretation that would be as similar as possible to what the speaker had in mind in the very beginning. And if you look at this whole thing, there are two things that kind of are important. The first is that this distinction between the cognitive and the social just falls apart completely in this story, because there is one level, the first level of the experiential intent is private and cognitive. Then the message is cognitive and social at the same time. It happens in our mind, but it is also created on the basis of the social negotiation. The utterance is formal, structural, social, and cognitive. So at each of these stages, there is a certain combination that makes those distinctions that were, the major distinctions in the 20th century. Cognitive and social, formal and non-formal, and so on, lose their meaning, because the system is exactly built, the logic of the system is built exactly on the idea that you have to iteratively translate from one level to the other, and the whole essence of the system is based on the idea that most of the work, which is based on social negotiation, has to happen inside our heads. That's the way the technology works. And because of that, it's very, very important for each of us to get to a point where the technology is kind of implemented in our mind. Okay, the technology that was developed out there has to be implanted into our mind, and this is why the question of language acquisition is such an important question. How do we get to the point where we actually know how to use this very, very complex technology? And the other issue was that this technology, complex as it is very fragile. And if you look at the different properties of this process, you can see that at every stage, the danger of miscommunication is there, totally together with the hope of the chance of communication. And every act of communication also includes a very strong component of miscommunication. Okay, that's basically where we were until now. And what I would like to do today is get deeper into this process of communication, what is happening to us when we communicate with each other. But before I do, I want to say one general sentence that should basically kind of introduce you to the type of thinking in linguistics that maybe most of you are not very familiar with. There are people who do historical linguistics, there are people who do social linguistics, are interested in the social issues, are interested in semiotics and the significance of language for social issues and so on. People who think of themselves as general linguists, who come from the tradition of, say, the American structuralists, the Prague school, and obviously Chomsky since the middle of the 20th century, have been interested in questions that do not at first sight, I would say, struck the non-linguist as self-evident, but they are very, very important questions. They're actually, they're at the core of what linguistics is about. And the questions are basically about what is it that determines why the structures of language look the way they do. Okay? Not just generally speaking, why there are words, and what is meaning, and what is the social significance of language, but actually, why is it that a certain sentence in a language is grammatical and another one is not? Why is it that different people have certain judgments about the grammaticality of certain sentences? Why is it that there are sentences that we all agree are grammatical, and some sentences that some of us would say, they're okay, and some of us would say they're not really okay? How do we get to the point where we can make those judgments? What happens when we actually utter sentences and produce them? Do we always produce them grammatically? What happens when we make mistakes? What's the essence of the mistake? In general linguistics, in the second part of the 20th century, there were basically two rivaling theories. And in a way, you can think of the theory that I'm developing, you can think of as a third alternative that I think is better than those two. But the two major ways of theorizing about that were the structuralist way, with Chomsky as president for life of that way of thinking, and the functionalists and cognitivists, two names for something that is in 90% of the cases the same thing. Chomsky's rivals, accepting the way Chomsky presented the question and answering the same questions with opposite answers. Okay, so for 50 years now, this was the major thing in general linguistics. Chomsky's idea, without getting into the details, is the following. We have in our mind something that we may call a grammar. Okay, and a grammar is a set of representations, not simply sets of all the sentences that we have heard in our lives, and the lexicon and the words and so on, but a certain representation of the essence of appropriateness in language, if you want to put it very, very informally. The idea is that there is a certain computational machine, a linguistic organ, doesn't matter how you want to call it, in our minds, and that machine knows something very general about the language as a rule-governed system. It does not just tell us about every sentence whether it's good or not. It has a certain capacity for generalization, and when we hear a sentence, we can figure out, this little machine can figure out whether it's grammatical or not, because the machine knows how to generalize over the question of grammaticality. As far as Chomsky is concerned, the linguistic organ, that capacity that we have, is innate. This is something that is not an issue for us today. It will become an issue when we get to the question of the evolution of language at the last lecture. But more importantly at the moment, it is formal. It is not about meaning, okay? It is not about communication. It is about the formal properties of language. So, for example, the distinction between subject and object is a formal distinction. It is about the mathematical relationships inside the sentence between certain elements. Which element resides next to the other? Which element is far away from each other? Which element resides where in a certain hierarchical representation of sentences? I'll get more into the details next time, but the basic idea is that there's nothing about the essence of language as a communicative system that determines what the linguistic organ can tell us about the grammaticality. Okay? So the simplest way to put it, and I wouldn't have even dared to put it this way had it not been the case that this is how I was taught when I was a first-year student. So I'm just giving you what I got, is saying, you know how you have those very, very thick phone books with all the numbers of the users of telephone around the city or something? You know that you can use it in order to change a light bulb. You put it on the chair, you stand on it, and then you change the light bulb. Okay? That doesn't mean that the properties of the phone book are determined by the function of changing the bulb. So of course we use language for communication. That's what happens. But language itself is a formal system whose properties are unrelated to the fact that we actually use it for communication. And of course, obviously, it has nothing to do with the social significance of this communication. And there are many, many issues that are involved. Universality and variability get into the picture. We'll get to all these issues one at a time. Okay? This is Chomsky. The functionalists have also thought in terms of a grammar in our mind that determines for us what is happening with the grammaticality of sentences. However, they were thinking in terms of meaning, they were thinking in terms of, or they are thinking in terms of communication, and the general idea that they're working with is the following. There is a universal way that we all experience. Okay, so you can think about it as the exact opposite from what I was starting with. Everybody experiences in the same way, not in the sense that we actually experience, this event right now in the same way, because obviously we don't, and nobody would argue about that, but in the Kantian sense that says that there is a set of categories that are totally universal, that there are human categories of perception, of categorization and so on, and we all, as human beings, we all experience in the same way on the basis of these categories, and these categories are the determinants of linguistic structure in our minds. So language is a reflection, like a naive reflection, of who we are as humans. And in this sense, functionalists actually play in Chomsky's playground and try to answer his questions with a different type of answer, because Chomsky is talking about the universal human and universal language, and the functionalists have been thinking in pretty much the same way. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the process of linguistic communication the way I understand it, this process that goes from the experience of the speaker to the experience of the listener. And in one sense, I'm just going to go on saying talking in more detail about what I was talking about last time. I'm going to describe a process. However, I would like you to kind of remember, in the back of your brains, that next week, what I will describe today will turn into a claim about these issues, okay? About why both Chomsky and the functionalists are wrong, and about how we can resolve the paradox, how bringing in society and bringing in variability into the picture can help solve those very complex questions that Chomsky and his rivals, the functionalists and the cognitivists, have been fighting about all throughout. Okay, it is okay. One last sentence again in terms of the background. Linguistics has found a very comfortable way, the discipline has found a very comfortable way to stay away from the relationship between society and sociology and the understanding of society and this whole pack of problems. Okay? Nobody denies, Chomsky, the functionalist, anybody, nobody denies that there are differences between languages, differences between societies, differences between the histories of languages, differences between this, what language means for people in different places and so on. Nobody denies that because it's a fact. Things have come to a point quite early, I think in the 60s and the 70s. By the 70s it was already there, totally arranged, where there are two disciplines. One is linguistics, which is general linguistics. It is about the fundamental questions of language. And then there is sociolinguistics as a sub-discipline that talks about whatever is interesting for people to talk about when they talk about society and language. Okay, so nobody has kind of argued that society is not important, but it has been kind of delegated to a sub-discipline. Okay, of course you can already understand from the first two lectures that what I'm trying to do is kind of drag linguistics back into the social sciences. Okay, but that does not mean for me that you can maintain this division of labor. There are very interesting and very complex formal questions that general linguistics has been interested in, and social theory of language cannot become a general theory of language without trying to solve those, because otherwise it would remain a sociolinguistic theory. So in a way what I'm talking about now is kind of asking you to listen to what I'm saying with two different ears. Okay, one as a continuation of the story that I started, another as an approach, another step towards getting into the core problems of general linguistics. Okay, so basically we're going back to this drawing, and what I'm going to do is simply go through the process step by step and continuing the description, and there are quite a few issues are going to come up. Remember how I talked about the experiential gap in the very beginning of the first lecture. The idea was we have different experiences of the world, we have different experiences of our involvement with the world, and we have to, in order to be able to communicate across the experiential gap, we have to find ways to mutually identify certain elements in those experiences that we can talk about. Okay. Now, there's another level in which the very same thing happens, but it is not the level of the way we experience the world, but it is the level of how we experience communication. Okay? This is another thing that we experience, and another thing that we experience differently. Okay? So just like we said, one person would look at that and see a chair, another one would see a red thing with a little black on it that he doesn't understand what it is. Another person would say, okay, this is the design of that designer that I don't like or that I like or whatever. Different people see different things in different things. So different people experience events of communication in different ways. Okay? So if you think about the experience of communicative success and communicative failure, Okay, we speak, we communicate. One person comes out of the conversation feeling this failed, another one actually feels like it was successful. How we experience our own sense of confidence in the conversation, how we experience confusion, understanding, misunderstanding, trust and insult, okay? Sincerity, deception, lie and truth. All these things are different between us. Many instances of miscommunication that you can actually, kind of, this is like a hobby of linguists, you can go through them sentence by sentence. You can see, and I think that this is something that we all experience in the most immediate way. One person says something that is meant, sincerely and nicely to be, I don't know, a constructive criticism. Another person is insulted by that. One person promises something, the other person hears a threat. One person asks something, the other person hears an unpleasant challenge. Okay, I ask you a question because I really want to know, and what you feel is this person is checking me to see if I know. Okay, and so on and so forth. Supposedly there are individuals in this world who will never experience any of these things. They walk about totally secure, and they are just oblivious to all these things. But I think that for the great majority of people, there's first a lot of experiencing that goes on in terms of what is happening to us when we communicate, and second, a lot of it is very, very different between people. Okay, so just like we have to mutually identify the meanings that we talk about, so we have to mutually identify the ways we communicate, or the way we work with our experiences of communication, so that, for example, we'll get closer to a position where if I tell you a story, you understand that I'm telling you a story. If I ask you a question, you understand that I'm asking you a question. If I'm trying to ridicule you, then you understand that I'm trying to ridicule you, but not the other way around. And also, there's a lot of other stuff that goes beyond these big, big feelings, to just get to a point where if I'm telling you a complex story that is built out of those building blocks of the symbolic landscape, it would be better if you manage to understand what happened before what, who did what to whom, that you wouldn't understand me saying something that is the other way around from what I tried to say, and so on and so forth. So, just like we have to arrange the symbolic landscape, we have to arrange what I call the communication protocol. We have to arrange protocols that are mutually identified, just like the symbolic landscape, protocols that would allow us to mutually identify our communicative behaviors. So, just like the symbolic landscape, when I say chair, and we mutually identify the word chair, we know here we talk about the same thing. The same way the communication protocol tells us about a lot of behaviors. Okay, here we do the same thing. Okay, I know how to ask a question, and you know how to ask a question, and we mutually know that, so that once I behave according to the regulation of how to ask a question, you know that I'm asking the question. Okay, so we regulate our communication, our communication by constructing those protocols or learning them. If you're born into a language, of course, this is what happens to most of us all the time. Think about speech acts. I've just mentioned quite a few of them, and there's a whole history of debate about what speech acts are. Okay, what is the speech act of asking? What is the speech act of promising or asserting? Okay, and again, generally speaking, there are two ways that have been brought up in terms of thinking about it. One comes from the British tradition of Austin and Searle, and has been actually formalized very, very nicely in mathematical logic by Searle and another guy, van der Wecken. And what this framework talks about is in a way similar to what Chomsky is thinking about in other domains. Speech acts are logical properties of language as such, regardless of who's talking, what the experiences are, which society we're talking about, and so on. Asking is asking, promising is promising. There are certain logical ways to do it. If you don't do it according to those logical ways, then you haven't done it. You can only do it properly to have a felicitous, that's the word they use, a felicitous speech act. It has to happen in a very, very specific way. So speech acts are actually properties that have come into language from logic, basically, okay? Which means they're totally universal, which means they are in our minds, regardless of the language that we speak, and so on and so forth. The person who has done most to try to kind of argue against that was Derrida in a very famous exchange of articles with Searle. He has made the claim, not a very constructive claim in terms of saying, you know, what the alternative would be, but a very important claim, saying that all this is an idealization, actually a prescriptive idealization. What Searle and these people are describing is the right way to do it from a certain point of view, which might actually be a British point of view. Actually, what is happening is when we do speech acts, there's so much confusion, so much misunderstanding, so much vagueness that is happening there, that none of those logical properties actually come into being. They are idealizations, nice idealizations, but actually there's nothing there that you can see empirically on the ground when people actually use language. The debate, by the way, between these two people is very, very funny, and I really recommend that you read it, mostly because regardless of the content, very, very quickly it became very evident that Searle is like dead serious about every sentence, and Derrida is just like having the fun of his life. And at one point, Derrida was writing a paper against Searle in this kind of, you know, joking mood. Searle became very upset, wrote something very, very angry. So Derrida published another paper saying, I'm fed up with this Searle guy. I can't argue with him anymore. Searle, this is the way you write John Searle, okay? So from now on he says, I'll invent a new person, okay? His name is John Searle without the E. He has the very same views that the original John Searle had, and from now on I'm only going to argue with him, which threw the actual original John Searle to high heaven, and it was like really two very smart people arguing in a very, very interesting way. So I recommend, you know, this as a good reading material. When you think in terms of the experiential gap, and if you think in terms of this foundational process of mutual identification, I think that what you can see is actually that the two sides have captured something very, very significant. There's no real argument about them, between them. They have been looking at two different aspects of speech acts, and from each angle, what they saw, they described quite well. Okay? Derrida could see very clearly the fact that as far as the experiential gap is concerned, indeed, there's nothing very, very clearly defined in a speech act that we try to express. Confusion and vagueness are there all the time. As far as the conventions that have been defined and developed through time in order to bridge this experiential gap, to bridge the gap of confusion and misunderstanding and so on, socially, by this negotiation of mutual identification, the utopia that is there, the idea, you know, of where we would like to get eventually, is one in which the conventions are going to be so strict, so clear, so well known and understood by everybody in the community, that we'll be able eventually to get to a point where there are not going to be any misunderstandings. Okay? So when Searle and Van der Wecken give you a very, very strict logical definition of speech acts, I think that in a way, what they're actually doing, they're doing a great job of suggesting a model of speech acts that is very, very sophisticated. There are even, you can even think about them as bettering the technology. They're giving you the best version of the technology possible from a certain social point of view. Speech acts are not in our minds just like that by birth before we started to learn language or before we start speaking. Okay? Once we are already speakers, like we all are here, once we are very used to the usage of the technology, we have a sense that goes with us most of the day, that we know exactly when we want to ask a question, when we want to say something, when we want to promise or threat, and so on. But if you think in terms of this process that I was talking about, if you think about the experiential intent that you have before you start speaking, and you try to go beyond those situations in which you automatically already know what you want to do, and then you'll see that the experiential intent many, many times happens in your mind in a way that is not at all clear whether it's an assertion or a question or something else. Take, for example, a situation where you go back home and there's this very expensive thing that you have, a vase, I don't know, like something, a very old and expensive vase that you have at home. You come home, you see that the vase is shattered on the floor, it's broken, okay? And there's one person there at your home and you suspect that this person broke the vase. You're angry, you're confused, the person doesn't say anything, okay? You don't know, are you going to ask, did you do it? Are you going to say, I'm very angry that you did it? Are you going to immediately say, I demand that you compensate me for that? Are you going to ask that person who did it, as if he's not the prime suspect and so on? If you try to kind of characterize the experiential confusion that is in your head at that moment, a part of the confusion of not knowing what to do, of being upset, is that you don't really know which of the pieces of technology that language allows you're going to use in the first sentence that you're going to utter. For example, if you're going to ask, why did you break the vase? Okay? Then by doing this, you're going to already presuppose that that person did that. What happens if that person didn't do it? Okay? Or if you ask, do you know who broke the vase? You give that person an opportunity to just say no, and then it is as if that person didn't do it, and so on. So a lot of the times, when we find ourselves not knowing exactly what we want to say, how we want to put it, and so on, it's not just a matter of, as we said in the last lecture, of breaking the experience into parts. It's also, for example, in the decision of which speech act we want to use. So speech acts are, just like elements of the symbolic landscape, speech acts are part of the communication protocol, and what they say is, through mutual identification, when I behave in this and that way, please know that I'm asking you a question. I'm not ridiculing you and I'm not telling you a story. I'm asking you a question. So, for example, we've mutually identified a certain intonation pattern that says if I put this intonation pattern on the sentence, please know that I'm asking you a question. Okay? If I'm putting another intonation pattern on the sentence, please know that now I'm telling you a story, or now I'm making a promise, or now I'm threatening you, or any of these other elements. And as we'll see, there's a lot of conventions that are involved in that. It's not a very simple thing. We have to learn, of course, how to do it as children. The communication protocol involves a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that is there. Basically, everything that we've learned from sociolinguists all these years, most of what we've learned there is in the protocol. The idea that we should speak differently in different places with different people, that class and status are involved, that you speak to children and to adults in different ways, or maybe you don't. All the cross-cuttings in society of language and gender, and language and power, and language and whatever else are there. All the enormous literature on politeness is there, of course, and so on and so forth. All these things are part of the protocol. However, at its core, the core of the protocol is an actual guideline, a practical guideline that tells you how to construct sentences. Okay? It tells you how you should use this technology right. Think about it almost as if almost as the way you think about that book that you get with your VCR or with your television, the new one that you buy. You get this book with practical guidance. Do this, then do that. It's a protocol that was constructed socially, and it's now in your head. It tells you how to do things. And now I say in parentheses, understanding that what we have in our mind is a protocol that tells us practically how to do things, as opposed to a grammar that distinguishes grammatical from non-grammatical sentences, is the strategy that I'm going to use in order to resolve the Chomsky functionalist debate. But this is going to happen next time. So we're getting into the protocol. And the idea is the relationship between the protocol and grammaticality is the following. As I said, there's no grammar in our mind. There's only that set of practical orders that tell us how to do things, because this is already how things have been mutually identified by the speakers in the community. When I work exactly according to the protocol and I construct a sentence according to the rules, my listeners, listening to the story, will say, aha, listening to the sentence will say, aha, this sentence is grammatical, okay? Because they have the same rules in their minds, and because just like I constructed the sentence, they have to go the other way around, from the sound that they hear all the way to the experiential interpretation. And if they manage to do it, and they go through the whole process, and they see that I've done things exactly according to the book, then they will say the sentence is grammatical, and by that, they're not just going to say something about the sentence, they're also going to say something about me. Because the whole thing is based on mutual identification, the understanding that I work according to the rules, according to the protocol, also says that I'm part of the community of the speakers of the language. Okay? So, my listeners are going to say, for example, native speakers of English, from Britain or from America, there are differences, of course, in the protocols, and there are differences in the symbolic landscape. But native speakers of English listening to me would say, okay, this guy has a rather nice command of certain elements of the protocol, but if you listen, for example, to the elements of the protocol that are about the phonetics and the phonology, the accent, you'll hear very easily that some of the protocol I'm not working according to, which means that as far as the English language is concerned, I'm not a full member of the community, and so on and so forth. We'll see later on that those elements of the protocol that have to do with accent are very, very important for the identification of identity, of the identification of the question of where you belong to. And again a sentence in parentheses here. When we ask a speaker to give a grammaticality judgment as linguists, we say, is this sentence good for you? Is this sentence not good for you? Okay? There have been two different views about this. Sociolinguists have always said, William Rebov, for example, is the most important person in this tradition. Sociolinguists have always said that eliciting grammaticality judgments from speakers is a very, very complex political act, because it depends totally, for example, on the question of who you are as the asker. Okay? It's in most cases very difficult for speakers to understand why you're interested in this question. In many, many cases, they feel threatened because it's like you're You're the linguist, you know everything about language, so to speak, so you're now checking them. Are they good enough with the language and so on? So there's a lot of complexities involved. But this was kind of, left at the level of the sociolinguists. General linguists, thinking about a grammar in the mind, were thinking, that this is a totally simple thing to do. You just ask the speaker, is this sentence good for you or not? Period. Okay? There's nothing very, very complicated there. Talking about the protocol and grammaticality judgment in this way, basing the whole idea on this idea of mutual identification, again, drags the understanding that grammaticality judgments are very complex political issues into the center of general linguistics. Okay, it's no longer an issue of the sociologists; it has to be an issue of linguists in general. This is related to another issue that has kind of influenced linguists so deeply in the last 100 years that it has actually kind of brought linguistics, to a certain freeze, and that is the distinction between competence and performance, the Chomsky distinction, and the distinction between prescriptivism and descriptivism. Both distinctions coming in from de Saussure from the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, de Saussure said there's a distinction between langue and parole, and then Chomsky developed this or changed this into this distinction between competence and performance. And the idea was competence is what we have in our mind, the grammar, that tells us whether a sentence is grammatical or not. Okay? The question of whether in our actual performance in day-to-day life we work according to what the grammar tells us is a sort of secondary question. We know what is right, then the question of whether we're going to do it right or not is a different one. We may, for example, stumble and not start a sentence and not be able to finish it. We may utter those, and all these things. We may be confusing what we're trying to do. All these things are secondary issues. The serious issue is that of competence, what is inside the mind. Okay? Functionalists have always said there's nothing that is competence the way Chomsky defines it. It is very, very important to look at performance, to look at how we perform in actual life, and not to try to idealize this idea of competence. When you think about the communication protocol as a set of rules, like that booklet that you get together with your VCR, that tells you how to do things, then you can very easily imagine thinking about all those rules basically as if you were thinking about law, the legal system in a certain community. Okay? In order to be able to participate in the legal life of the community, to be a legal citizen, there are certain things that you have to know. You have to internalize certain ideas, not to cross the street at a red light or whatever. But you're not always going to follow the law. Sometimes you're going to break the law. Everybody breaks the law from time to time, and there are going to be certain situations in which you're going to go with the law, certain situations in which you're going to break the law, and so on. The communication protocol is not a grammar. It tells you how your community decided that communication should proceed. You may then, in your performance, sometimes go with it and sometimes not. So again, competence and performance, once you get them out of the mind in terms of a grammar, and you understand them as a set of prescriptions coming in from the society and telling you how to behave, you can see that both competence and performance they live together. It's not one or the other. They happen together in our mind. We know the laws, some of them, not always the same, but we also decide from time to time to go with the law, sometimes not. Okay? De Saussure said, we have to stop prescribing as linguists. We have to describe languages as they are, instead of telling people how to behave linguistically, we have to describe the way they actually do. So, for example, we have to be able to describe the linguistic systems of social classes that are lower than the upper one. So not just the language as it is supposed to be, Her Majesty's English, but also varieties of, for example, English which belong to lower classes, because we're not prescriptivists, we're descriptivists. And the distinction that was taken up by Chomsky and pretty much everybody else became such a strong distinction in the overall structure of the theory that in a way what we totally forgot, that the system that we're supposed to describe, the linguists, is itself a prescriptive system. It is a system that the community has devised in order to tell its members how to behave. So the system itself, language, the communication protocol, is a prescriptive system. Okay? Just like the symbolic landscape, it is based on the fact that different people behave in different ways, and it tells those different people, look, if you want to get to a point where other people understand you, behave in this way that is already mutually identified with the others, and then you'll get better chances of communicative success. So the system itself is prescriptive, and it is prescriptive to the core. The whole idea of language as a social system is that it is a prescriptive system. We as linguists are not supposed to participate in the prescriptive process, but we have to remember what we totally forgot once we started thinking about grammars in the mind, that the system that we're describing is itself a prescriptive system. It's very, very important. Not necessarily a point that would resonate with you very dramatically, but had you been linguists of the type that does general linguistics, it would be very, I think, almost probably very difficult for you to accept, because we all got used to the idea that prescriptivism is a notion that has been expelled from linguistics. Actually, the subject matter of our descriptions and explanations is a prescriptive theory. One little story in parentheses that is just a story that I very much like. It turns out that the Saussure himself left an enormous amount of handwritten texts and so on in his house that for a very long time people didn't look at, and in the last few years people have started doing serious work on him. And it turns out from his letters to friends and so on that he was not at all sure about the distinction between langue and parole and the other distinctions that have become so important for us as linguists. He writes to a friend, I sense that there's a distinction there. It's a very, very complex issue. The problem is that my students ask me for strict definitions of where something starts and the other thing ends, and I decided to actually distinguish these things for them. But I find it oversimplified. I don't believe this. I'm looking for other ways to formulate that, and so on and so forth. Then he died, and two of his students took their lecture notes and published the Cours de Linguistique Générale. He didn't publish it, they published it on the basis of their lecture notes. And the distinction between langue and parole, just like other distinctions, became commonplace in linguistics. They are the foundation. And for me, I think there's a certain irony in the discovery that the fact that the book was actually published on the basis of the lecture notes of the students actually changed the history of linguistics in a very deep way. Let's start looking at the stages of the process, starting with the most important one, the most crucial stage in this whole business, which is how do you get from the point where you have an experiential intent that is prior to language and is not formulated in language, how do you get from that to a point where you have a semantic message, the building blocks of which resemble your intent to the best of your ability? The point to put in your mind, I think that the experience that I would like you to think about now is the experience of trying to understand what a 3 or 4-year-old or 5-year-old sometimes tries to tell you when he or she are very excited about something and they have a story to tell you. Okay? The problem that they have there is not necessarily that of finding the words for the building blocks of the message, because sometimes they do. Sometimes there is a problem, but a lot of the times they have the words. The problem is that of the immediate translation of certain elements of the experience into words or constructions, which are then produced in a way that does not allow you, as the listener, to actually get a reasonable representation of what we're talking about. And the kind of thing that happens to you, for example, as a parent, time after time, is this kind of thing of like, stop for a second, okay? Breathe. Now, tell me, who was there? Okay? What happened? Okay? Did you get hurt? You know, this kind of thing of trying to teach the child, or, you know, in certain cases you're not interested in teaching the child, but in actually getting to understand what the child is trying to say, to arrange the elements that the child already knows how to use from the language in a way that will allow you, as the listener, to reconstruct some of this and get to understand which parts are where. Okay? So the first stage that I'm going to talk about in this process is the following: a first preliminary set of prescriptions that tell you in the very beginning, before you have something, you have an experiential intent, you want to say something. The technology tells you, first of all, you have to make certain fundamental decisions in your mind before you start talking to me. And the first fundamental decision that you have to make is at the upper part of the third page or something. It's called the speech act, topic, entity, eventuality. You see that? The idea, even though it's written in this kind of formal language, the idea is simple. What it says is the following. Before you start talking, make 3 decisions in your mind. Okay? Decide whether you want to ask me a question, tell me a story, threaten me, or do, you know, which kind of speech act would you like to make, which will then oblige you to behave in a certain way according to the conventions of the language. Tell me who you're going to talk about, and tell me what happened. Okay? So decide from the very beginning, are you going to ask, you break? Did you break the values, or assert, I hate, like I hate you for breaking the vase, or, you know, any of the options that you have. Let me just say one thing in parentheses that I forgot to say, and it's important. The process that we're going to go through now is a process of the construction of a sentence in English. Okay? This does not mean in any way that any of these things is universal, that they apply to other languages and so on. The whole view that I'm bringing here is radically about variability. Languages may be as different from each other as they want to. We'll talk about that in the 5th lecture, but for convenience, because we're speaking English now, I'm going to show you a process that is about a sentence in English. Okay, so just this is a big issue in linguistics. What happens when you bring English examples? Does that mean, for example, with Chomsky, does that mean that you're saying something universal? When Chomsky brings a sentence, Chomsky has this way of saying, let's take a language, for example, English. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just saying this is the most convenient thing that I can do now use English because you're all playing this thing. Okay, now speech acts, topic entities, and eventualities, you have to understand all of them are already prescribed prior to the event of communication because they have to be mutually identified. Okay, so the language says between you and me now, when we're speaking a language, there is a certain set of verbs, each of which is about an eventuality. You can choose. You have to choose one of them. There are words that you can use to pick up a type of topic and choose a speech act. Okay, and make this decision before you go on. We'll see there are going to be more stages, all of which are going to happen in your mind with a general idea that says, look, just like what we say to the child, before you actually start talking to me, I want you to go through the whole process of the translation of the experience into a semantic message in your mind, arrange it in your mind, and then come to me with something that is arranged and obviously, just like I said before, sometimes we go by the law, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're not capable of doing that. It's a very, very important thing to understand that sometimes, for example, when the experience that we want to communicate is, for example, extremely traumatic, then the capacity that we're used to in a day-to-day situation of arranging, of doing all this work with the technology, and eventually arranging grammatical sentences that should, tell you what we wanted to say experientially, all this process is very, very difficult for us, and sometimes there's no other way for us to communicate but to say a word here and a word there, just like that child that is not capable of arranging the sentence. But the booklet, the protocol tells you how to do it in the right way, socially speaking, and okay. So the first stage we said was the selection of a speech act and a topic entity and an eventuality. And then now we're going to go through certain stages in which this message kernel, this kernel of the message, this combination of the three things is going to be gradually, the language allows the speaker to gradually develop and add more detail to this kernel of the message. Okay? Basically, the stages that I'm talking about are going to be stages in which, at the beginning, language tells you, make the great big decisions, which speech act you're going to use, about whom, what happened, and then in the next stage add more detail, and then in the next stage add more detail, and so on, so that eventually you'll have a representation in your mind of all the semantic elements that you want to connect to each other, and then you'll have to connect them to each other in order to create the utterance. The best metaphor for the process that you can think about is actually a metaphor that has joined our lives not too long ago. It's exactly the process that many times happens to us when we try to get some forms filled up on the internet. So you fill up 3 or 4 empty spaces and you hit enter, and then on the basis of these 4 you get another empty page that you have to fill in. You fill it in another page and so on. So the whole process is iterative, and the whole process is based on the intuition that I was talking about before. If you try to arrange a translation of your experience into a semantic message all at once and bringing all the elements of your experience into the message, you're never going to be able to do it, and you'll get to the point that is similar to what the child does in this kind of situation, just throw words, unrelated words to each other. The idea here in the protocol is go through the stages one at a time, and at each stage you're going to be allowed by the protocol to add more detail. So we started by the first stage of speech act, topic entity, and eventuality. Assume that you now decided that the speech act is going to be the speech act of assertion. We're going to tell a certain story, and the topic is going to be a boy. You're going to say something about a boy, and the event is going to be one of breaking. Okay? You chose from the arsenal that language allowed you 3 elements, and now you can move on. In the second stage, language tells you, okay, look, remember in the symbolic landscape from the first lecture that the different digital points, each of which refers to a mutually identified experience, all these are semantically related to each other. So for example, the sign for break, the signifier for break, will be related to what we call the thematic roles in the first lecture. It will be connected to a stereotypical thing that was broken and a stereotypical thing that broke it, and so on. Those elements that are stereotypically involved in events of breaking. So language tells you, okay, fine, if you want to use the verb break, now the second page on the internet, the second stage that you have to go through is to fill in a form that includes all the different extensions that language allows for an eventuality of breaking. That's the first, this thing, the first table here. It tells you the following thing. Look, you want to talk about breaking, now you can specify what was broken, the patient, who broke it, by which instrument was it broken, what was the goal of the breaking, what was the reason of the breaking, what was the manner of the breaking, the time frame, the time, the place, and so on. There's an enormous amount of formal work in what's called lexical semantics, a domain of linguistics, that shows you that 2 things. First, every verb has these elements kind of encoded in its meaning, in the semantic relationships with other elements on the symbolic landscape, and different verbs have different elements of this type. So if you think, for example, about break and dance, okay, so in dance you don't have a patient, you only have the agent that dances. Break has this combination of the agent, the patient, and the instrument. And next week, when we get closer to those issues that Chomsky was interested in, we'll see that these things are extremely important for issues of grammar. And some of these extensions that you can fill in, just like on the internet, are obligatory. Some are not. If the patient is obligatory for an event type of break, what that means is that the protocol on the basis of social negotiation, on the basis of this idea of mutual identification, the protocol tells you, as a speaker of the language, the following thing. If you want to talk about breaking, you may or may not take the trouble to tell me what was the instrument that was used in order to break that thing. It would be nice if you did. It would be informative, but you don't have to. If you want to talk to me about a breaking event, at the very least, I want you to tell me what was broken. Okay? And I think that, just like I said before, the best way to understand the logic behind this is to think about events in which you communicate with small children. Okay? It broke, you know? What was that thing? Can we start with this simple question? What was broken? Okay? So, time frame, for example, here is again a notion from linguistics. Did it happen in the past, or is it happening now, or will it happen in the future? This is obligatory. You have to tell me something about the time frame. Time is like Tuesday at 6 o'clock. You can tell me, but you don't have to tell me. So certain elements are obligatory and certain are not. Assume that the form was filled up, as you see at the bottom of the page, with the patient is the vase, agent is the boy, which is also the topic, and the time frame is past. Okay? This leads you to another stage once you've filled it up. And this stage is going to have as many substages as you want iteratively. It's going to do the following thing. You've filled up the minimal requirements for detail, as language asks you to. Now there's another set of questions that language asks you. Okay? For example, you said boy. Is this a singular boy or many boys? Okay? Singular or plural? If it's singular, is it definite or indefinite? For example, meaning, is this a boy that we already mutually know? Or is this the boy? Or is this a boy, someone that we don't know together? Okay? You may decide to put in answers, and then you'll get another page. And you may decide to fill more detail there and get another page and so on. And one of the things that, for example, the process allows you, when you have a certain entity that you refer to, for example, boy, there's this thing that I put here called other event. The system allows you to say whether this boy also participated in another event. So, for example, the boy who broke the vase, okay, the boy who we both saw yesterday at the theater broke the vase. So the boy is the one who broke the vase, but there's also another event, the event of seeing, in which it was the thing that we saw. So the system allows you to add more and more detail, and on the basis of each detail that you add, there are going to be additional questions that the language is going to ask you, and you eventually get to a point where you have what is called there the complete message. Okay, at the bottom of the, I think it's page 3, what you're going to get in this complete message is first all the building blocks, each of which comes from the symbolic landscape, that you have chosen to use in order to first approximate your experiential intent. And again, just like we said last time, for the same type of experience, different people with different talents, different usage of ideas about language, different capacities with language and so on, are going to produce different sets of those building blocks, are going to be able to capture their experience in different ways and so on. That's the first thing. So this iterative process of message construction gets you to a point where eventually you have all the building blocks that you need. And the second thing is that they're going to be arranged in your mind in the according to the stages by which they were produced. Okay, so the break and assert and boy, which were the basic issues that you decided to focus on in your message kernel, are going to be at the, say, upper side of the hierarchy, and from there on, things are going to develop hierarchically. The relationship between the left side of this box to the right is basically a relationship between what's important and what's less important, what you are going to focus on and what is going to be a detail. Okay? Those of you who know something about general linguistics can see that if you look at the box like this thing also already looks pretty much like a syntactic tree. And I will make the claim next week that Chomsky's idea of the syntactic tree is actually a total epiphenomenon if you take the process of gradually constructing the message on the basis of the experience, and you take it away from the process and you make it into something that is static, and you divorce it from experiences and from society, from mutual identification, from negotiation, from all these things together, and you just look at the relationship between certain formal entities that are about this process, then the frozen static thing that you remain with looks like a syntactic tree. But the syntactic tree is not really there, and we'll get there and talk about it for a lot of time. From the complete message, you get to a point where each and every signified that is there has to be replaced by the signifier. Okay, so the signified chair is replaced by the signified chair. The signified the, like definite article, is replaced by the signifier, and so on and so forth. So the first stage of utterance construction is one in which you've finished collecting all your signifieds. Now you replace them with their signifiers, and then the second, and then the next stage that you're going to have to go through is one in which you take all these signifiers and you arrange them according to certain conventions, say linearization conventions in languages like English. You'll have to arrange them so that they will eventually fit the linear nature of the speech stream. Okay? So remember, we started with an experience that is holistic and extremely complex and ineffable by its very definition. We went through a process that was governed by the protocol, in which we gradually selected elements from the symbolic landscape in order to first approximate our experience. Then we replaced them with signifiers. Now we have to create something that, as opposed to the experiences and opposed to the semantic message, is linear, because our sentences, when we actually utter them, have to have sounds arranged one after the other. Okay, this is something that is not a property of any of the former things. So you have to have conventions for linearization. You have to know how to linearize them. Okay? English, for example, is very strict about these things. English has a lot of conventions for linearization. Other languages, Japanese, for example, have very little of that. They have other types of conventions that English doesn't. There is variability between these, and each language has different linearization conventions. Parentheses. The whole of Chomsky's story about syntactic trees, I mentioned them 5 minutes ago, is based on the notion that strict word order, which is a property of English, for example, is actually an underlying property of all languages in the world. Okay? So that languages which do not have strict word order, like Japanese and other languages, have to have underlying mechanisms in them, according to which the sentences are produced at deep structure, just like English. And then the elements may be scrambled in order to create all kinds of flexible word orders, which are not what you find in English. Okay? The story here, once you put things back at the social domain, obviously this problem is solved immediately. Language, as a result of a long process, by the way, English has not always been like that. Word orders were more flexible, in Chaucer's English, for example, but today's English is very, very strict about what can come before or after which word, and you have to know the conventions, and you organize them, the signifiers, according to a certain order, and then you have to do everything that you have to do in terms of phonology and phonetics, connect the words to each other phonetically, change certain sounds because of the phonetic connection, and actually produce the sentence as sounds, or of course, if you speak a sign language, as signs with the organism. There's one thing that I want to emphasize here, which is very, very important. This whole process, because it is based on conventions that are so deeply internalized by us as children, the whole process happens most of the time subconsciously. Of course, from time to time, we sit with a piece of paper and a pen and actually work very hard to construct a sentence. But most of the time, it happens to us totally automatically, subconsciously. Now, one thing that happens to us a lot in day-to-day conversations, and even more when we actually try to seriously debate an issue or something like that, is a situation where we start producing the sentence. We go through the process of selecting those building blocks and arranging them and so on. And then we start uttering the sentence. This is the first time that we actually hear the semantic message that we're actually constructing. Now, all we know is the experience or the experiential intent that we had in our mind, but subconsciously we went through a whole process where this was already translated into semantics. So we hear 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, and all of a sudden we stop and we say, no, no, this is not what I wanted to say. No, this is not good. I'll try again. Okay? So there's a whole process in which we are actually in a loop with ourselves and sometimes with other people, in which we try to approximate our intent, go through all this technological stuff. No, it didn't work. Again, just like, you want to draw a picture of someone. You draw it for the first time and you look, no, it doesn't look similar. You try again, it doesn't look similar again, and so on. There's an enormous emphasis in all existing theories in linguistics, all the theories that were kind of born in the middle of the 20th century, an enormous emphasis on when things work right. So an enormous emphasis on sentences that are just perfect from whichever way you want to look at them. They're perfect grammatically, they say exactly what you wanted them to say, and so on and so forth. From the point of view that I'm talking about, from this foundation, it talks about language as this fragile system used in order to communicate experiences that are incommunicable. Instances of broken speech, instances where you start speaking and you stop and you understand that this is not what you wanted to say and you start again and so on. Instances like this are much more revealing about the essence of the whole system, because they are exactly instances where something is discovered about the inner workings of the mind, not just regular situations of hesitation and so on, but actual situations where you find yourself saying something that was not what you intended to say, and you may now start thinking, if you want, for example, about Freudian slips and other instances of this type, which have not found themselves a place in regular linguistic theories, and for example, stayed in the psychoanalytic understanding of language, and now have a natural place to be. I would like to take just a few moments to say one or two things about the process of comprehension. What happens to us when we listen, not when we talk. Basically, we go through the whole process the other way around, but we do not do the same things when we listen as when we speak. We have to use the same protocol and have the same modes in our minds, because the whole idea is based on mutual identification. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand each other. But we do not have to solve the same problems, or we do not find ourselves facing the same obstacles when we listen as when we speak. Okay? Think, for example, about ambiguity. Okay? The problem of ambiguity. Think about lexical ambiguity of the simplest type. Okay? The word bat, that both means a baseball bat and the bat, the animal. Okay? This is like, bats are a classical example. In linguistics, if you think about the process of speech production as I described it, the problem of ambiguity, lexical ambiguity, of the type that involves the two types and two meanings of bat, is never a problem that arises for you when you speak. Okay? The experience that you want to talk about is either about this animal that flew, into your face, or about something that happened to you in the baseball game, and you may or may not have a problem finding the right word, but you're not going to find yourself, having to resolve the problem of figuring out which type of bat you want to talk about. As a listener, this is always going to be a problem that you're going to have to solve, most times it's going to be easy to solve because there are going to be other words related to baseball in the same sentence or whatever. But ambiguity, lexical in this example, but also syntactic or formal ambiguity and so on, these are problems that are going to be problems of listeners. Okay? Now, again, linguistic theory in the second part of the 20th century, thinking statically about grammars, about mental representations that say this is right, this is wrong, this is what happens, this is what doesn't happen, has taken ambiguity to be a problem of language in general. Okay? Whereas when you think about the process of linguistic production and comprehension the way I was talking about, you can see that ambiguity is a problem that is about listeners and not about speakers. What that means is that we may think about the process of mutual identification, of negotiation, of ways of speaking, according to the following, rule of thumb, just one of many, not a singular one, but one of many, other things being equal, as speakers who are interested in developing the language, so that they will be able to express their experiences as well as possible. As far as the speakers are concerned, they are not going to care about ambiguity. What do I care if there are two words that sound the same but have different meanings? Listeners are going to be worried about that because this is going to be a problem that they have to solve. Of course, listeners and speakers are most times the same people, obviously, but people in the role as speakers and people in the role as listeners. In terms of the interest of listeners, it would be a good thing for us to develop more tools, additional elements to the technology, to reduce the level of ambiguity. As far as speakers are concerned, this is not necessarily an interest. So the social negotiation of the structures of language, of the protocol, of the symbolic landscape, is not just going to be a struggle between different individuals on the basis of power, on the basis of their will to express themselves, and so on and so forth. It is also going to always be a sort of struggle between producers and comprehenders, between people whose job is to say what they want to say, and people whose job is to understand. And there's a lot of stuff that comes out from this understanding about how the structures of language actually get to be what they are, compromises between the needs of speakers and the needs of listeners. Okay, and this is a direct result of bringing the process of linguistic communication back to life from the static representation to something that actually happens. One last point. There's a lot of stuff here that I would like to say, but I will just move on to this one last point. As a listener, you hear the sounds, you construct an utterance in your mind. There's a lot of stuff to say about how we don't have the time. Then you construct the message on the basis of the utterance. And when you get the message, what you actually get is something much more narrow than people have thought about. You only get what is the stereotypical meaning of this sentence for the members of the community, because you get certain building blocks that were mutually identified and their relationship. You get the stereotypical meaning of the sentence for the members of the community. In order to understand what the actual person speaking to you wanted to say by using this sentence, that is, in order to get an experiential interpretation that is similar enough to the experience that actually gave created the intent and the whole process, you have to be able to take this semantic message and actually re-embed it within your own experiential world, embed it in your experiential world, not perfectly re-embed, because your experiential world is different from that of the speaker, but put it back inside experience and take each of those semantic elements, each of those semantic building blocks, each of which is this triple thing, get back from the arrangement of signifieds into their experiential clusters and rearrange, imagine, construct in your mind an experiential representation on the basis of the semantic message, that would hopefully be similar to what the speaker tried to say. We sometimes say to our children, when we talk to them about something that they read or something that they heard, okay? You haven't understand what you read until you're capable of saying it with your own words. Okay, this is like a rule of thumb that we adopt many times in the way we communicate with children. In this model, I think that this idea comes to life in a very, very vivid way. The idea is the following: as long as you read something and you have you construct a mental representation in your mind of the semantic message, of the combination of signifieds and the relationships, as long as you stay there, you haven't created an experiential interpretation of your own of what was said there. You are left at the level of the technology. You get a representation of what the technology was capable of giving you, the stereotypical meaning of that sentence for the community of speakers. In order to actually understand what you were told, you have to be able to re-experientialize the whole thing and get your own experiential interpretation on the basis of that semantic message. If then you want to leave the role of listener or reader and actually adopt the role of the speaker or writer and say what you understood, you're going to have to start the whole process again, now with you as the speaker, and go from an experiential intent, the intent being just to say what you read, but to start with an experiential intent, which is again beyond language, and start the whole process of building the semantic message gradually according to the stages in order to say what you understood. If you do it within your mind on the basis of your experiential world, then there's no chance in the world that you're going to construct the same sentence that you read in order to say what you understand. You're going to say something very different, not necessarily, by the way, the right one. Okay, people do make mistakes, but the essence of understanding a semantic message is actually in the ability to go beyond language. The essence of the ability to use the technology of language for communication actually lies in the ability to first go through all the stages as the technology dictates, but then most importantly go beyond the technology and construct your experiential interpretation of it. And then if you want to restate what you read, most probably you're going to say things in a very, very different language, which is going to be your own rendition of this thing. There's a lot of stuff that I would like to talk about, but we don't have time. The general idea is, first of all, there's a very, very long list of prescriptive conventions coming in from society, implanted in your mind in the process of language acquisition. And what this process tells you is how you're going to be able, how you're going to have